A shimmering, dazzling expanse of marble. One of the most stunning church towers ever built, grand and elegant. Immortal works of art that transport us to a divine realm. And all this crowned with an architectural masterstroke unsurpassed to this day. Florence Cathedral, a vehicle to express the pride of the citizens of Florence, as well as a monument to their faith. Generations of Florentines participated in its construction, in the knowledge that they would themselves not live to see its completion. They toiled in honor of God and the glory of their city for 170 years. The cathedral radiates a timeless beauty and gives expression to a unique period in the spiritual history of the Occident, a time in which people began to view both God and themselves in a completely new light. And not least, the cathedral is rock-solid proof of the fact that an individual can sometimes achieve the apparently impossible, and thereby usher in a new cultural epoch. In the late 14th century, a little boy is growing up in the alleyways of Florence. Everyone calls him Pippo, although his real name is Filippo. It's an exciting time. Florence is in its heyday. The city is one of the largest trading hubs in Europe. It's ruled by powerful guilds, the most wealthy of these being the Arte della Lana, or Wool Guild. Members had become trade magnates, responsible for arranging the weaving of sumptuous woolen cloth and its export across Europe. The city is bristling with new constructions, imposing churches and magnificent palaces. Near Pippo's house too, vast brick walls are shooting up skywards. The tallest of them all, the walls of a new cathedral. Every day Pippo passes the building site. His father, Ser Brunellesco, is a city dignitary, and Pippo dreams of one day becoming a famous master builder and completing the monumental construction. The people of Florence have already been working on the new church for 80 years. The square where it's located has been a sacred district for many hundreds of years. In Roman times, it was actually situated on the outskirts of the town. In the 5th century, the first church within the city walls was built here, directly alongside the northern city gate, with a baptistry and bishop's palace in front. This formed what was known as the Asse Sacro, or sacred axis. Archaeologists excavated the foundation walls of the ancient church around 40 years ago, beneath the floor of today's cathedral. Their work revealed the remains of a typical late Roman basilica, adorned with wonderful mosaics. It had been dedicated to the Saint Reparata, an early martyr from Palestine. The Church of Santa Reparata was renovated and modified several times over the course of the centuries. It was finally upgraded to a cathedral in the 12th century, after the bones of Saint Zenobius were brought here. He's venerated as the first bishop of Florence and is to this day one of the city's patron saints, together with Reparata and John the Baptist. In Roman times, the baptistry opposite Santa Reparata was smaller than the current building, but octagonal just as it is today. And that was no coincidence. The number 8 is a symbol of eternal life. God created the world in 6 days. The 7th was a day of rest, and the 8th will be the day of his second coming. This symbolism was particularly explicit in the Middle Ages, because the chapel was surrounded by a cemetery at the time. This meant that one had to traverse the zone of death to be cleansed and reborn as a Christian in the baptism ceremony. In the mid-11th century, Florence went through a major economic and political boom. In the year 1059, the Florentines also began enlarging their baptistry. It became the city's pride and joy. The great poet Dante named it Mio bel San Giovanni, or My Beautiful St. John. With a diameter of 26 meters, the cupola was the largest in medieval Europe. The magnificent mosaics also testify to the city's wealth at the time. In keeping with a tradition of Byzantine icons, they're set against a background of pure gold, a symbol of the glory of God. They display the entire history of the world in 59 tableaux, beginning with the creation. In the second row, they relate the story of Joseph, one of the progenitors of the chosen people of Israel. Scenes from the life of Jesus follow. The lowest row of mosaics shows the story of John the Baptist. He baptized Jesus, and the baptistry has thus been dedicated to him. The most important mosaics above the altar take up the theme of rebirth through baptism. In the center, the figure of Christ with a stigmata, risen from the dead. Beneath him, on Judgment Day, the dead also arise again. But they're divided. On his right, Christ invites the righteous into paradise to eternal life in the sacred fold. On his left, however, Christ shows the back of his hand in a gesture of rejection, and beneath this hand, the sinners burn in hell. These mosaics were created between 1220 and 1290, and still adhere to the style of the Middle Ages. We know that some of them are the work of craftsmen from Venice, a place where artists maintain the Byzantine mosaic tradition. But we don't know any of the artists by name. In medieval times, it's the work itself that matters. It's the images and their message that are important, and the artists are simply craftsmen who carry out the will of God. This is why they don't usually sign their work. Incidentally, a legend claiming that the baptistry was once a Roman temple persists to this day. It's a legend that does contain a grain of truth. The pillars and many of the marble slabs do indeed date from classical antiquity. The glorious new baptistry even served as a temporary cathedral, while the old cathedral of Santa Reparata was left to go to rack and ruin. The Florentines were busy building up their trade empire. Culture would have to take a back seat. That attitude changed at the end of the 13th century. Florence was now one of the largest cities in Europe, a fact that should at last be reflected by the cathedral. Siena and Pisa had already upped the ante, building spectacular new churches. The Florentines were not about to be outshone any longer. The city needed a new cathedral, a state church in keeping with the status of Florence. In the year 1296, the commission for its construction was awarded to Arnolfo di Cambio, one of the most influential architects and sculptors of the Middle Ages. He was municipal architect of Florence at the time, and the designer of several buildings, including the Palazzo Vecchio. Arnolfo conceived a typical Gothic cathedral, one that differed from traditional designs in one respect. At its eastern end, it didn't consist of the usual transept and choir, but of 3 apses that took up the octagonal form of the baptistry, in what's known as a triple apsidal church. But Arnolfo died just 15 years after construction work began. At the time, the walls of the new nave were rising up around the old cathedral. At the west wall, Arnolfo had designed a Gothic facade with pillars, reliefs and statues. At the time of his death, it had been completed as far as the top of the portal, and it would stay that way for centuries. This is also how it would have looked to little Pippo Brunelleschi around the year 1380, a half-finished Gothic facade that had already begun to look rather dated. After Arnolfo's death, the cathedral project was shelved for some 20 years. In 1331, the administration of the cathedral construction project, or Opera del Duomo, was passed to the Wool Merchants Guild. These people had economic clout and got things moving again at last. Giotto di Bondone was appointed Arnolfo's successor. He was principally famous as a painter and the founder of a completely new technique. Instead of the symbolic images of the Middle Ages, Giotto painted the world in its true form, vividly and vibrantly. People had never seen anything like it, and Giotto became the pioneer of Renaissance painting. His main contribution to Florence Cathedral was the design for the new bell tower. Construction work officially began on July the 19th, 1334. But Giotto was to die just 3 years later. Only the lowest section of his campanile had been completed. But the master had already introduced his successor several years before. The wool barons wanted to replace the main wooden portal of the baptistry with a bronze door. On Giotto's recommendation, the sculptor Andrea Pisano was awarded the commission, and he created a masterpiece. Pisano subdivided both doors into 28 sections. The lowest sections show the 7 virtues and humility, all of them additionally identified with Gothic inscriptions. The upper 20 sections relate episodes of the life of John the Baptist, the central motif of the entire baptistry. The story begins up on the left, where an archangel informs Zacharias of the birth of his son John. The baptism of Jesus represents the zenith of John's life as his most important task in the story of salvation. That's why Andrea set this particular scene at eye level. And it's a scene that encapsulates the master craftsmanship of its creator. Christ is standing in the Jordan River, and the underwater refraction has been perfectly rendered in the relief. The last panels depict the death of John, which begins with a dance of Salome. As a reward for her performance, she requests the head of the Baptist. The gruesome idea comes from her mother Herodias. John had dared to criticize the queen, and in revenge she gets his head. Andrea completed these wonderfully vivid doors in the year 1336. 4 years later, he was appointed new chief cathedral architect. Like Giotto, he focused his efforts on the tower. He built 2 further sections and adorned them with rows of relief panels. The cycle begins on the western side with the creation of Adam and Eve. After their expulsion from paradise, humans must earn their bread by the sweat of their own brow. They soon find ways of making life easier. For example, they start to keep animals. According to the Bible, Jabal is the first cattle breeder. His brother Jubal invents music. This was Andrea Pisano's central theme, the creativity of human beings inspired by God. And logically, for the first time, we see depictions of the practical arts here, architecture, for example. This was something quite new. Like all manual work, since antiquity it had been regarded as a lower art form, unworthy of an educated man. But Pisano's reliefs show that people were now becoming more self-assured and that manual work also found recognition. Pisano devotes an individual medallion to the invention of weaving, a nod to the Guild of Wool Magnates, which had after all commissioned the project. In the upper levels, the panels are not octagonal but diamond-shaped. They portray allegories of the planets, and on the north side the 7 sacraments, some of them the work of Andrea's assistant Maso di Banco. Pisano's reliefs display a spatial depth similar to that found in paintings by Giotto. So similar, in fact, that some wonder if the designs were not actually the work of Giotto himself. On the eastern side, on the upper level, the virtues, and finally, the pinnacle of human inventiveness, the 7 liberal arts, symbolically portrayed, such as here, for example, grammar. Andrea Pisano died after building 2 new sections of the tower. His successor Francesco Talenti eventually completed it in 1359. He had again added 3 sections, this time with large Gothic windows and dispensing with any further figural ornamentation. This way he gave the tower its elegant airiness. At last, Francesco Talenti now focused his energies on the cathedral proper again. He may have taken over Arnolfo di Cambio's designs, but he made them even more monumental. This is especially evident today from the windows. The most westerly are the work of Arnolfo. They're lower and more slender. Talenti's designs included broader arches, which consequently made the windows larger. After these changes, the wool traders now had to agree on a final blueprint for the cathedral. And the way to do that was the same then as it is now, through an architectural competition. It says a lot about the atmosphere in Florence at the time that the winner of this competition was not the cathedral's master builder Talenti himself, but a group of artists which included architects, but above all painters. Their new design set down an idea that most likely came to Arnolfo too. To embody the greatness of the city of Florence, a mighty cupola would rise up over the cathedral crossing. The Florentines were very impressed. There was just one problem: no one knew how to build such a cupola. In the year 1401, Pippo Brunelleschi is a grown man. He's completed an apprenticeship as a goldsmith, and this makes him versatile as someone with an appreciation of aesthetic matters, as well as knowledge of metalwork and mechanics. He's brimming with self-confidence, and he gets his big chance in yet another competition. The next portal of the baptistry is to be cast in bronze. Filippo submits a design, one that the jury admires with astonishment, before rejecting it. The commission is awarded to a colleague of almost the same age, who's also a goldsmith, Lorenzo Ghiberti. The 2 designs are on show today at the Museo del Bargello. They were so superior to all the other submissions that the jury ended up choosing between the 2. Both designs relate the story stipulated by the construction authority. Abraham rides with Isaac to the sacrificial site, ready to sacrifice his own son if it's God's will. At the last moment, however, God stops him and sends a lamb instead. Lorenzo Ghiberti's design appears more balanced, with a coherent group of figures harmoniously integrated into the available space. The scene is divided up along diagonal lines. Down on the left are father and son on their way to the sacrificial site. On the right we see Abraham preparing to sacrifice Isaac. Right at the top, the angel brings him the redemptive lamb. Brunelleschi's figures, on the other hand, appear to want to break free of their confines. He accentuates the drama of the situation. Abraham has already put his knife to Isaac's throat. At the very last moment the angel appears. It's a more modern interpretation of the story, more gripping than that of Ghiberti. Both artists draw on the art of antiquity, which is experiencing a revival at that time. Brunelleschi even incorporates a specific motif. The figure on the bottom left is reminiscent of the famous spinario, or boy with thorn. Although Filippo's design is viewed as the second best, he's deeply insulted by the defeat. This is according to the architect and mathematician Antonio Manetti, later Filippo's friend and successor. He's provided us with the oldest report on the life of Brunelleschi. 100 years later, this biography was embellished by the famous Giorgio Vasari. He relates how the frustrated Filippo moves to Rome after losing the competition, together with a young apprentice of sculpture named Donatello. The pair make a great team. Both of them are hot-headed and stubborn, and both will go on to ring in the Renaissance in their own particular field. Together, the friends wander through the Roman ruins. The Eternal City is certainly looking a little worse for wear. While it used to have 1.5 million residents, now its population has shrunk to just 20,000. They dwell in a small settlement on the banks of the Tiber, afflicted by malaria and plague. They despise the ancient ruins as the vestiges of pagan idolatry. They destroy many of them out of superstition, or simply use them as quarries. Filippo and Donatello see things differently. For them, the old walls are not the work of the devil, but examples of great architecture. Disguised as treasure hunters, the two men take a very close look at the majestic remains. Filippo Brunelleschi seeks direct inspiration from the architecture of antiquity, the first architect since the migration period to do so. He's especially fascinated by the Pantheon. At this time, it's almost 1,300 years old, and its cupola is still of the largest in the world. Perhaps Filippo finds some clues here as to how one might repeat such an architectural feat in Florence. Unfortunately, what he sees doesn't help him much. The Romans cast the cupola from concrete, but the technique has been long forgotten. There are even rumors in the Holy City that the Pantheon was built by the devil's own hand. Several years later, Filippo returns to Florence with a head full of new ideas. Firstly, he ushers in a revolution in painting by developing central perspective. The technique at last makes it possible to realistically portray spatial depth on pictures and reliefs. Filippo's drawings have unfortunately since been lost, although they were a sensation at the time. Meanwhile, work on building the cathedral has progressed. The old Santa Reparata church has been demolished, and services are being held in the new nave. Although it's only half finished, the church leaves an overwhelming spatial impression. With a length of 153 meters, it's to become the largest of its epoch. And even today, 600 years later, Florence Cathedral is the world's fourth largest church. Since 1412, it's officially no longer dedicated to Reparata, but the Mother of God, Santa Maria del Fiore, or Saint Mary of the Flower. The flower is on the one hand a reference to her son Jesus, who's often portrayed as a flower on the family tree of Jewish kings. On the other hand, the dedication is an allusion to the city itself, founded by the Romans as Florentia, which means the flourishing one. But the cathedral is still just a torso. no one is any the wiser as to how to build the massive cupola over the crossing. In the year 1418, the wool barons finally resort to a tried and tested solution and announce another competition. Submissions are received from the best architects, including Filippo's old rival Lorenzo Ghiberti. He has in the meantime become one of Italy's most famous artists. Filippo himself is also on board. Although he has absolutely no experience as an architect, he has big ideas, and the winner of this competition is guaranteed celebrity status. It's hard to appreciate today what an incredible challenge the Florentines had set themselves. No one had even attempted to build a dome of anything like these dimensions since antiquity. They envisage it rising up over the vaults of the church naves, and to heighten its majestic impact, the Florentines have also placed a 10-meter tambo on the crossing. At a height of 52 meters, the design foresees 8 interlocking vaults, a typical Gothic building technique known as a cloister vault, in itself nothing new. But the tallest Gothic vaults ever built in Beauvais Cathedral are only 48 meters tall at their apex, and the Florentines plan to start erecting their dome at a point 4 meters higher than that. And Beauvais Cathedral was never completed. Most of the vaults collapsed after just 10 years, and that's with a span of just 15 meters. The design for the dome at Florence foresees a diameter of almost 45 meters, 3 meters more than the Pantheon. Added to this, a technical problem. Vaults are usually built on wooden templates, a technique known as centering. The templates support the stones while the mortar hardens. The centering templates for the Florence dome would have to be unimaginably large, a full 90 meters high, as well as support a massive weight. The cupola today weighs around 37,000 tons. A huge scaffold such as this would require 700 enormous tree trunks, and although the Cathedral Construction Authority owns an entire forest, the cost is too great even for the wealthy Florentines. But there's no other way of building it. The forefathers had hoped that God would one day communicate the right design to someone. Is Filippo Brunelleschi that someone? For the wool magnates, he seems an unlikely candidate. At the age of 41, Filippo has never worked as an architect. Worse still, instead of coming up with a sensible suggestion for the construction of the centering, he submits a risible plan, claiming to be able to build the cupola without a centering at all. And as if that isn't enough, he's demanding that they simply snap up this crazy idea. He's frightened that someone might steal his designs, and that's why he's not prepared to explain in detail how he would tackle the job. The only thing he does say is that the cupola will consist of 2 shells. The internal shell supports the actual weight, while the external one protects and strengthens the cupola. The 2 shells are connected by a system of ribs. The jurors are faced with a dilemma. Should they take Filippo's word for it that he can achieve something that is utterly impossible? Or should they favor a more conventional approach, although they know that this cannot work? They initially do the most obvious thing, namely nothing. Meanwhile, Filippo wins his first architectural commission to build the Ospedali degli Innocenti, the city's new orphanage, and he immediately demonstrates his mastery. Clear geometric forms, classically balanced proportions, windows and slender pillars that lend a regular structure to the facade. Brunelleschi's building is viewed today as the first true Renaissance construction. More than a year goes by before the jurors at the Cathedral Construction Authority make a Solomonic decision. They select Filippo's model and appoint him to the post of new master builder. There's simply no alternative. But at the same time, they appoint a second master builder of equal rank, Lorenzo Ghiberti. Of all people, Ghiberti, his arch-rival. Filippo is exasperated. Over the decades that follow, he'll channel a great deal of energy into getting rid of his competitor, and eventually he'll almost succeed in doing just that. But before construction can begin, there's yet another practical problem to be solved. How to transport blocks of stone weighing almost 1,000 kilograms up to such dizzying heights. Up to now, this had been done using pulleys driven by laborers in treadmills. But with such heights involved, that's not going to work. And even when the stones are up on the walls, how can they be maneuvered precisely into position? These questions were all part of the competition, but none of the entrants has come up with any answers, apart from Filippo, that is. He's been fascinated by mechanics all his life. Antonio Manetti reports that he constructed clocks, and that he even built the first ever alarm clock known to humankind. Now he's presenting designs for machines that leave his fellow men speechless. Buonaccorso Ghiberti, Lorenzo's grandson, captured them in drawings. For decades they're admired across Europe. But Filippo is again afraid that someone might steal his ideas. That's why he arranges for each component to be built by a different craftsman, and for all the work to be done outside Florence. The first machine to be unveiled in the summer of 1420 was a freight elevator, the likes of which no one had ever seen before. The crane rope alone weighs half a ton. It's 180 meters long, the largest cable manufactured to date. Only the shipbuilders of Pisa are able to make something like this. The crane itself is not powered by humans, but by oxen. They're patient and strong. The only problem, they cannot be persuaded to go backwards to lower the rope. Filippo comes up with a brilliant solution. The drive shaft can be adjusted so the elevator gets a forward and a reverse gear, while the oxen always walk in the same direction. At a height of 90 meters, the second miracle machine takes over the load. Il Castello looks amazingly like a contemporary crane. On a wooden mast, there's a revolving boom. That's where the crane operators stand at breathtaking heights, tossed about by the wind. Using a shaft, they can move their platform inwards and outwards, with a counterweight simultaneously moving on the other side. Immense forces are being exerted on all these constructions, but physical calculations are completely unknown. All Filippo can do is rely on his instincts, and they must be outstandingly good, because both cranes function without the need for major repairs throughout the entire construction period. Building work begins on August the 7th, 1420. 8 teams of masons work simultaneously on all sides of the dome. The competition has dragged on for a long time, and things really have to get moving now. Workers are not even allowed to climb down for a lunch break. Filippo arranges for a canteen to be set up between the shells of the cupola. The statics of the huge dome present an enormous challenge. The outward pressure generated by its own weight is one of the biggest problems facing any dome construction project. Filippo has chains of sandstone beams laid at regular intervals along the wall's outer edges. And immediately above the first chain of stones, he mounts a chain of chestnut wood beams. It stabilizes the dome even in the event of an earthquake, as wood is more flexible and tension-proof than stone. The construction of this chain of beams provides Filippo with the opportunity to scheme against his co-architect. He's still niggled by the fact that Lorenzo Ghiberti is paid the same wage, although all the ideas are his. Suddenly, Filippo falls critically ill. Lorenzo has to continue the work alone. But the chain is a complicated construction, and as usual, Filippo has let nobody in on the subtleties of his designs, least of all Ghiberti. Not surprisingly, Lorenzo struggles to cope. After a few weeks, Filippo makes a miraculous recovery and inspects Lorenzo's botched job with a demonstrative shake of the head. And indeed, the original pay sheets show that Ghiberti's wage was actually docked completely after this little performance. The opera administrators soon reverse their decision, but from now on, Filippo is in sole charge of the cupola project. Not that Lorenzo Ghiberti is just anybody, he's one of the most famous artists in Florence. And the same year, 1425, he celebrates a triumph of his own. He's completed the new doors for the baptistry, the very commission he once won against Filippo. Just like Andrea Pisano did before, Lorenzo has also subdivided the doors into 28 sections. At the bottom he depicts the church fathers and the 4 evangelists. In the 20 sections above those, he relates scenes from the life of Christ, this time from bottom to top. At the start, the Archangel Gabriel announces the birth of Christ to Mary. In the following panel, the Christmas story is portrayed. An angel also appears to the shepherds in the fields. As the storytelling continues, viewers move their gazes steadily skywards. The climax eventually comes right at the top. The Passion of Christ, His crucifixion, the resurrection, and finally the Pentecost. Lorenzo has also included a small portrait of himself. He's now 40 years old and at the pinnacle of his fame. The new doors meet with unanimous admiration. Lorenzo is immediately awarded the commission for the 3rd portal, this time without any need for a contest. Filippo Brunelleschi is not even considered for the job. But in the years that follow, Filippo's role as chief architect is undisputed. Lorenzo is primarily concerned with the cathedral windows. No comparable cycle of glass paintings is produced in Italy in either the 14th or 15th centuries. The windows in the nave depict various saints from the Old and New Testaments. The saints to whom the cathedral is dedicated maintain a glowing presence in the chapels around the choir. The round windows in the tambour are devoted to Jesus and Mary. Alongside Lorenzo Ghiberti, some of the city's greatest artists are also working on the 44 windows, among them Paolo Uccello, Andrea del Castagno, and Donatello. Filippo's old friend has in the meantime become the most respected sculptor in Florence. For the facade and the campanile of the cathedral, he created statues that completely altered the evolution of sculpture. They're among the cathedral's most valuable works of art. To protect them from environmental damage, the statues displayed on the tower today are copies, created in the sculpture workshop of the Opera del Duomo. The master craftsmen here work just as Donatello himself did more than half a millennium ago. Donatello's sculptures are now on show in the museum, where it's clearly evident just how radical they were at the time. The old Gothic statues are idealized. They symbolically portray certain functions, for example, the prophet. Donatello, on the other hand, shows people, such as the prophet Habakkuk, fondly named Pumpkinhead by the Florentines. The prophet Jeremiah also looks like a real person. It's said that a friend of Donatello's modelled for this piece. Just as Giotto's paintings had done, Donatello's sculptures ushered in the Renaissance period. His style became exemplary for generations of artists. It also conveyed a new spiritual message. Donatello shows that even the prophets and apostles were people, just like the people of Florence who looked upon the statues day in, day out. This makes them a perpetual source of encouragement. If they're faithful, even ordinary people can become saints. This is the basic conviction to which the entire Cathedral of Florence is dedicated. Donatello creates one of his most poignant statues for the baptistry, the Magdalena. She's portrayed as a rueful sinner, covered only by her long hair. Donatello's statue makes her suffering almost physically tangible, and appears strikingly modern even today. In total contrast is the singing gallery that he designs for the cathedral, just as the dome is nearing completion. Donatello's colleague Luca della Robbia has already created a gallery. In its reliefs, children sing and play in praise of God, just as it states in Psalm 150, "Praise him with timbrel and dancing, praise him with stringed instruments and pipe." Luca's design adheres completely to traditional forms, but Donatello disregards those constraints and allows the children to run riot along the entire length of the gallery, even unceremoniously breaking through the boundaries of individual sections. In February 1426, the cathedral dome is 17 meters high. Now the walls tilt to such an extent that the bricks are sliding inwards. It must be a fearful sight for the masons as they look down without their usual scaffold to support them. All they can do is have faith in Filippo's ingenuity. The wool magnates are confident, and a committee still sees no need to erect a centering. And Filippo rewards their trust with a stroke of genius. He has the walls erected in a herringbone pattern. It's a familiar technique. Bricks are laid horizontally, then at intervals of just under a meter, one brick is placed vertically. The Romans built this way long ago. But Filippo recognized the fact that because the walls are slanted, a kind of mini vault forms between the vertical stones. This means that the last brick in every layer has the effect of an apex stone, and layer for layer, a stable, self-supporting construction is created. Using an ancient construction technique to build an impossible dome, that's Filippo's ingenious idea. The approach has yet another advantage. Even the vaults themselves no longer require an apex stone. This means the top of the dome can remain open, and light falls into the church through the oculus. But not everything goes swimmingly for the great Filippo. There is, for example, his plan to revolutionize marble supply. The white slabs come from the quarries of Carrara, and transporting them is incredibly expensive. They are shipped to Pisa and from there dragged up the Arno to Florence. But the river is barely navigable, and sometimes marble is in such short supply that the cathedral authority requisitions reserves for gravestones. Filippo scents a good business opportunity and pledges to cut the shipping costs by half. He constructs a monstrous amphibious vehicle, a barge and low loader rolled into one. He receives the first ever patent for the design. But the venture turns out to be a huge flop. the monster barge runs aground on the sandbanks of the Arno on its maiden voyage. Tons of precious marble are lost, taking a third of Filippo's fortune down with them. Things go wrong for him again 10 years later. During the Florentine siege of the neighboring city of Lucca, Filippo devises a cunning plan. He suggests digging a trench and simply flooding the city. But the idea is a total disaster. Filippo manages to inundate the Florentine camp as well. The Florentines are forced to make a hurried retreat, and Filippo is never again awarded a military contract. But this does nothing to curtail his fame. His magnum opus is finished at last. On March the 25th, 1436, Pope Eugenius IV dedicates the new cathedral Santa Maria del Fiore. Little Pippo Brunelleschi, who had once played in the shadows of the brick walls, has achieved the impossible. There is yet another competition for him to enter. The crowning feature of the cupola is still missing, the lantern. This time Filippo easily wins the contract. It's clear to the Opera del Duomo that the lantern is an important element of the dome's structural design. It can't be too heavy, but on the other hand it must be heavy enough to provide additional stability to the vault. Construction of the lantern begins in 1445, using Carrara marble and increasing the height of the dome by 20 meters. It will eventually be completed by Brunelleschi's successor, the same Antonio Manetti, to whom we owe the first biography of Filippo. In the year after work on the lantern began, Filippo dies suddenly, not even 70 years old. The entire city of Florence mourns his passing. Filippo Brunelleschi was the first architect in history to be revered as a great artist during his lifetime, and the first never to have received instruction at a mason's lodge. Not adhering to traditional techniques, but relying on his own inventions and instincts, fully aware of his own genius and always looking to build on his reputation. All this has nothing more to do with the total piety of the Middle Ages. Brunelleschi was the first modern architect. And he still holds one record to this day. He's created the largest masonry dome of all time. The dome of the Capitol building in Washington is almost a third smaller. Filippo is, of course, buried inside his cathedral, but his grave is forgotten. It's only rediscovered during excavations in 1972. Filippo doesn't live to see his rival's greatest triumph. He's already been dead for 6 years when Lorenzo Ghiberti completes the last portal for the baptistry. For 25 years he's worked on the project and created an immortal masterpiece. This time, Lorenzo subdivided the doors into 10 larger sections. He relates several stories within each section, embedded in complex settings. The first panel up on the left shows the creation of Adam, then the creation of Eve. Lorenzo lends an astonishing depth to what are almost flat images. The scene depicting the fall of man, for example, he places in the background. Here not only are the figures smaller, the relief is also flatter, thereby suggesting a rather hazy distance. The expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise forms the transition to the next section, which shows how humans are now obliged to earn their own living by physical toil. The image of Noah's benediction contains astonishingly realistic renditions of a lion and an elephant, a sensational sight for the people of Florence in the year 1452. The central panels, placed at eye level, have particularly interesting backgrounds. Lorenzo transposes the story of Jacob and Esau, who sells his birthright for a plate of lentils, to a monumental city, and applies with the utmost perfection the rules of perspective developed by Filippo 40 years earlier. Apart from their artistic mastery, the reliefs also contain many political references. For example, the figure of small but victorious David is often used as a symbol of the city of Florence. The famous sculpture by Michelangelo springs to mind. The last scene shows Solomon meeting the Queen of Sheba. This is an allusion to the Council of Florence, where the Catholic and Orthodox churches had reconciled their differences in 1439, a major coup for the Florentines. The success was, however, short-lived, as the schism persists to this day. Lorenzo has again included a self-portrait. He's now over 70 years old. The Gates of Paradise, as they're known, are his most famous and his last work. 3 years later, on December 1st, 1455, Lorenzo Ghiberti also dies. The portal is world famous to this day. Michelangelo himself is said to have cried out at the sight of the doors that they were indeed worthy of their lofty label. But in reality, the name Gates of Paradise probably stems from the fact that the space between the cathedral and the baptistry has always been referred to as paradise. This is where Lorenzo's door finds its place. Andrea Pisano's portal is relocated to the south side, and that is a sensation. Up to now, the main portal showed the life of John the Baptist. That befits the baptistry. With their baptism, people demonstrate their commitment to the gospel of the New Testament. But Lorenzo's portal relates stories from the Old Testament. Actually intended for the side entrance, it now usurps the old doors, and for one single reason, because it's more beautiful. That would have been unthinkable in the Middle Ages, but now the beauty of the work of art and admiration for the artist are more important than the biblical content. A new worldview has taken hold. The Renaissance is born. So Lorenzo Ghiberti also found his fame and glory. To this day he's revered as a brilliant sculptor. But Filippo has also made a lasting contribution to art. His new perspective technique soon becomes the standard throughout Europe. In the cathedral itself, it's not only Lorenzo who employs the technique. The sacristy is lined with magnificent intarsia work. Illusionistic pictures such as these were not possible before Filippo. A generation after Filippo's death, the lantern is crowned with a huge sphere of gilded bronze. It was the work of the sculptor Andrea Verrocchio. It's probable that his apprentice helped out, a young man by the name of Leonardo, from the little town of Vinci. He's particularly fascinated by Filippo's machines and studies them in detail. Filippo's work plays yet another quite surprising role at the dawn of the Renaissance. The astronomer Paolo Toscanelli, who had once taught him mathematics, affixes a bronze plate to the inside of the lantern, converting the dome into a huge sundial. This enables him to determine the positions of the sun more precisely than ever before, thereby improving navigation. This in turn benefits one particular seafarer with whom Toscanelli corresponds regularly, a certain Christopher Columbus. So Filippo's dome even makes a small contribution to the discovery of America. In the year 1515, Baccio d'Agnolo is the master builder of the cathedral. He begins building a loggia at the base of the dome. But its proportions don't quite fit. With biting sarcasm, Michelangelo calls it a cricket cage, and it's never completed. But Michelangelo contributes more than just censure. His famous David was actually intended for the cathedral. And the Pietà created by the sculptor for his own grave graces one of the cathedral's chapels for centuries. Initially, the inside of the dome was simply painted white, and that remained the case for more than 100 years. Filippo himself had envisaged a mosaic design, like that of the baptistry. But in the year 1572, work began on a fresco for the dome, and the artist awarded the commission is none other than Giorgio Vasari. Filippo's great admirer and biographer, now allowed to embellish the work of the man himself. The picture is hailed as the largest Christian fresco in the world. Over a surface area of almost 4,000 square meters, it does take up the subject of the images in the baptistry, the Last Judgment. The focal point is again Christ standing in judgment over the world, surrounded by angels. In the past, a sculpture of the body of Christ lay in the center of the altar. This made the message of Christianity crystal clear. When the faithful raised their gaze from the dead Christ towards the heavens, they beheld the resurrected Savior in all his glory. The graphic images at his feet bring home to them what they can expect in the future, the promise of paradise or the horrors of hell. From an artistic point of view, the work is considered slightly off the mark. The most serious criticism is that it makes the dome appear lower than it actually is, and not higher as intended. Nevertheless, the fresco is brimming with original ideas. For example, scaffolding installation holes double up as symbols of the wisdom of the written word. Books offer an access to the realm behind the surface of our world. But Vasari doesn't live to realize his design. He dies after just 2 years. His successor is Federico Zuccari, who'd previously worked mostly in Rome. He completes the huge work in the year 1579. 8 years later, the exterior of the cathedral changes yet again. Francesco de' Medici has the half-finished facade by Arnolfo di Cambio removed. He actually plans to build a new one, but he doesn't get around to it. That's why for 300 years, the front of Florence Cathedral is clad in nothing but brick, which the Florentines cover with large swaths of painted fabric. Again and again they haggle and fight over a new facade, but no progress is made until the 19th century, when Florence becomes part of the new Kingdom of Italy. In 1887, Emilio de Fabris finally completes the facade in its present form. He's primarily inspired by Giotto's bell tower, and his design is chosen in yet another competition. To this day, the cathedral is the spiritual heart of the city. It embodies the unique spirit of Florence. The cathedrals of the Middle Ages were filled with a mystical atmosphere, an expression of the hope of a better life in the afterworld. Florence Cathedral, on the other hand, is filled with light and faces the world head-on. Its greatest work of art is actually a brilliant feat of engineering, and the artworks inside the building also celebrate illustrious people. First, the builders of the cathedral itself, Arnolfo di Cambio and Emilio de Fabris, Giotto, and of course Filippo Brunelleschi. Alongside these portraits are two large frescoes. Paolo Uccello depicts Giovanni Acuto. His real name was John Hawkwood. He came from England and became a great military leader in the service of the Florentines. Next to him, Niccolò da Tolentino, painted by Andrea del Castagno. He was also a successful commander who did the city a great service. Faith itself has also changed. This is evident from two works of art that seem to embrace the faithful. Above the main portal there's a mosaic from the period of Arnolfo di Cambio. It shows Mary, the Mother of God, being crowned by her son Jesus. Opposite her there's a shining window high above the altar, the only eye of the tambour visible upon entering the church. It's the work of Donatello, and it also depicts the crowning of Mary. At the entrance and at the heart of the church stands the Mother of God. She was also revered in the Middle Ages, but now her message is being understood in a new way. Mary is a human being chosen by God. People themselves are being given the power to change the world. And this belief was the inspiration for the immortal masters, to whom we owe the cathedral itself and all its art treasures. The cathedral that celebrates the greatness of an inimitable city, as well as the birth of a new epoch.